For joining us. If you are coming to take a seat, please do so. I'm going to introduce your chair for the afternoon, and this event is No More False Solutions, the Struggle for Real Climate Justice. We have our chair, Zainab Oguz, is a lecturer in anthropology of development at the University of Edinburgh. Her research interests include the politics of fossil fuel extraction, energy transitions, insurgency and counterinsurgency, nationalism, and lately right-wing environmental movements in Turkey, Cyprus, and the US. Unfortunately, Alex Lee was not able to make it today. Rick Lander from Friends of the Earth Scotland will be in her place. And please also check out our exhibition downstairs on a history of resistance to coal in Scotland, which was organised of the Earth Scotland. Can we have a huge round of applause for our speakers on our chair, please?
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Hamza. So today we will be discussing No More False Solutions and how the links between climate justice, false solutions, and energy justice. So I will let each speaker talk about their work, their research, and their activism, and then I will ask a few questions, and then we will get questions from you, audience. So shall we start with you, Hamza?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, good. So I guess you hear me. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for the Radical Book Festival in Edinburgh for hosting a conversation around the book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region, a book that I co-edited with my colleague, Katie Sandwell. And thank you for joining that conversation so we can talk broadly about the false solutions that the global ruling classes are putting forward in terms of tackling the climate crisis, especially after the disaster of the COP29, the climate summit that was just held in Azerbaijan, in Baku. I was there actually for a few days to do some work. But what I want to do in my introductory remarks is try to tell you a story and weave in some of the ideas and arguments from the book. Of course, those arguments come from experiences in the Arab region, but I really believe that the lessons are universal because similar dynamics of dispossession, neo-colonial dynamics, expropriation, false solutions are being advocated in other contexts and other regions. But before I do that, I think it's really important when we talk about questions of colonialism, decolonization, climate justice, it's important that we acknowledge the reality of genocide taking place in Gaza today. Because I don't believe that we can talk about those issues about dismantling colonialism, green or otherwise, and talk about climate justice in the Arab region and globally without, denouncing what takes place in Palestine, perpetrated by a deeply racist apartheid and settler colony of Israel, with the active support and complicity of Western imperialist powers, from the United States to the UK, to the European Union, to France, to Germany, and to others. I think it's really important that we continue standing up together to call for an immediate ceasefire, the end of the genocide and the escalation of the war in the Middle East, but much more importantly, we need to continue supporting Palestinians in their struggle for their liberation and uphold their right to resist with any means necessary. I think it's really important to put that in context. So what we are currently facing is a global climate crisis. The outlook and the impacts of that global climate crisis are differentiated through class, race, gender, from urban to rural areas, from the global north to the global south, but they are also differentiated through colonized and colonizer lines. That what we are seeing in Palestine, where Palestinians and Israelis inhabiting the same terrain, but the impacts are much more worse for the Palestinians because the climate crisis just exacerbates the existing reality of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, dispossession, and plunder of resources. And in terms of North and South, the differentials or the disparities, I always bring the example of Libya. Libya last year, just in September, there was a disaster, a climate disaster there. Of course, it intersects with other problems in terms of political, economic problems, and the chaos that the imperialists caused by the intervention in Libya a few years ago, a decade ago. But what happened? A storm started in the northern Mediterranean, Greece, Turkey, and Bulgaria. It caused serious material damages, but I believe it killed around 20 people. That storm intensified throughout the Mediterranean. When it was traveling to the South Mediterranean, it landed in an eastern town in Libya called Derna, and just in 24 hours, the whole town was destroyed, with around 11,000 to 20,000 people dead, just in 24 hours, just to see the disparities. But the mainstream dominant narrative that we've got around the climate crisis is that we are all in this together. We are all equally responsible, and every one of us need to do their bit in terms of states, in terms of individuals, and so forth. There is some truth in terms of common responsibility that everyone needs to do something about it. But this narrative is deceptive. It does not tell the whole truth. Because if we look just at the historical cumulative CO2 emissions from the 18th century with the start of the Industrial Revolution, some countries in the north, the European Union, UK, the US, Canada, Australia, these countries on their own are responsible for causing 50% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. And then when we look at the wealthiest amongst us, that's why class is very important when we talk about the climate crisis. 1% of the richest amongst us at the global stage, which is around 77 million people, emit more than the 2/3 of the poorest in this planet. So you have 77 million people, which are the millionaires and the billionaires of this world, emitting more than 5 billion people in this planet. But then, when we go to the responsibility in terms of the corporate sector, because there is always these discussions, we are the individuals, we need to do our bits, just the 20 biggest fossil fuel companies in the world, and those are not just in the north, but also in the south, including my home country, Algeria, but also in the Gulf and Chinese companies, but also the big Western majors like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Eni, and Total Energies. Just those 20 per year, they emit around 1/3 of the CO2 emissions. So you see that narrative that we are all in this together and everyone is equally responsible does not stand. So to address this crisis, the global ruling classes, the richest of this world, are proposing the old ways, but under a green cloak. They talk about the green economy, sustainability, green growth, which are basically green capitalism. It's not even green, it's capitalism just pretending to be green. So it is the same paradigm of accumulation by dispossession, through privatizations, privatizing everything, through commodification of and financialization of nature. And there are many of these examples being put at the table, especially in the climate talks, in the COP process, what is called the Conference of the Parties. And I think it's much more appropriate to call it the Conference of the Polluters, because what they are suggesting are profit-making false solutions so they can maintain the status quo, they can maintain extracting and exploring for fossil fuels, while at the same time pretending that they are doing something for the environment, which is greenwashing, but much more importantly, they want also to dominate the nascent green value chains, technologies in renewable energy, like they want to dictate to us what kind of transition and how it is being done and at what pace. So they want to control those. And we hear about those false solutions: net zero, nature-based solutions, carbon markets, carbon credits. Carbon markets are big, have been big this year in the climate talks in Azerbaijan. It is a complete false solutions. They are scam, they do not work, but they are still being promoted as a solution to the climate crisis. But those carbon offsets projects, something that I want you to gather, they are not just do not work. They create further injustices in terms of grabbing land from local communities and indigenous communities in the name of conservation projects. And there are companies, including Gulf companies, one of them is called Blue Carbon, that has been acquiring hundreds of thousands of hectares in 5 African countries: Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, Liberia. And they're gonna use, you know, the same environmental, colonial environmental narrative of terra nullius. The land is empty, there is nobody there. But it's not true. Communities are being dispossessed, while the responsibility of tackling the climate crisis, mitigating the climate crisis, and reducing the CO2 emissions is being shifted from the historically responsible for causing the climate crisis, from the biggest polluters and emitters, including the Gulf countries, to the least responsible and the most vulnerable and the least equipped in terms of technology and finances to tackle that climate crisis. So that green transition that they are talking about, it's not really a transition. First of all, it is an expansion. It is an addition. We are seeing fossil capital and green capital interlocking with each other and working in parallel. And much more than often, the same fossil fuel companies like BP, Eni, ExxonMobil, Total Energies are also involved in those renewable energies. But renewable energies are not really displacing fossil fuels per se. We are still seeing a lot of investments in fossil fuels, a lot of subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry, a lot. Just like between 2020 and 2022, those subsidies to the fossil fuel industries globally went from $5 trillion to $7 trillion. So if they are talking about transition, I don't know why you're giving those subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. So this transition they are talking about is corporate-led, capitalist transition that wants to maintain the profits and even realize new frontiers of accumulation for the capitalists. It's not really led and working or led by working people and in their interests. So energy is still seen as a commodity to be traded and sold to the highest bidder and to be secured by the most powerful nations, while over 800 million people do not have access to electricity. Most of these 600 millions are in Africa. So in attempts to decarbonize, the richest of the world are doing everything to assert their hegemony and have an unfettered access to green energy, critical raw minerals needed for the electrical batteries, for the solar panels like lithium, cobalt, graphite, copper, and so forth, reproducing neo-colonial dynamics and extractivist practices. That's what we call green colonialism, green extractivism. And there are many examples in the region, and I'm sure they are similar in other parts of the world. I'm just gonna say two of them. So there is this big project being put forward by the ex-CEO of Tesco with a consortium of companies, Saudi Aqua Power, and then there are other companies as well. They want to build big solar plants and wind farms in southern Morocco and to export the electricity through an undersea cable that they need to build that will bring the electricity to the UK, specifically to Devon, so they can heat the houses of 8 million people. Some people would say, okay, this is gonna be a win-win project, it's gonna work for everybody, but it's not really. 80% of the electricity in Morocco is generated from imported fossil fuels. So why do we need to build those solar plants and wind farms so we can produce green electricity to export it to Europe? Isn't the priority to, achieve the needs of the local population and green the grid first? The green hydrogen hype is the same. Green hydrogen is this like miraculous solutions that they have been, that the governments and capital is trying to promote, but to replace gas. Basically, it can be used in cars, in ships, in planes, but also to heat homes. But its problem that it is made from water. So in semi-arid countries where that water needs to go into drinking and agriculture, it does not really make sense. Similar cases are happening in Namibia, Morocco, Mauritania, Egypt, and the Germans are big on that. They want to dominate that nascent green hydrogen value chain. They want to use the lands of other people, the water of other people, and there will be no technology transfer, but there will be only an externalization of socio-environmental costs and the creation of new sacrifice zones for sustainability. So if we're gonna continue in the same way of producing stuff, excessive, socially unnecessary, and leading or imitating the imperial mode of living in the north, we are going to intensify the production, and we're going to intensify also the decarbonization by dispossession and the creation of those sacrifice zones. So I think we need really to have a proper discussion about alternatives, but yeah, these are my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamza. I have so many questions, but I will stop. I won't ask them now because we will hear from our next speaker. And if you could introduce yourself and yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me at absolute latest possible hour. We haven't actually met before because my colleague dunked me in this with minus 15 minutes to spare. So, but I'm so grateful that people have showed up to the Roxy on what is possibly the muckiest day in years in Edinburgh. Really, really grim outside. And thank you so much for having me. My name is Rick Lander. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm research manager at Friends of the Earth Scotland. Alex Lee, unfortunately, is not able to be here because they live in the hills, and it's an absolute nightmare to get into Edinburgh, as I'm sure everyone here knows. So Alex sends their apologies. Friends of the Earth Scotland we have a staff team based here in Edinburgh. We work with activists across the country, and we have thousands of members. And we're also an international, grounded in international networks. So Friends of the Earth International has many groups around the world, and this allows us to participate in global climate justice in a really kind of vivid way often, that we're speaking with people on the ground in other countries who are pushing for change in those fence line and frontline communities. In Scotland, we advocate for change by working to take our cases to decision makers, but increasingly we find that's pushing through mud often, and it's necessary to be organizing with people both nationally, but also street by street and in neighborhoods as well. And we're really excited to be moving into a kind of new phase of the organization where we're looking to do we're looking to really organize at community level, which I think is given the global political context where we all need to put in our attention as activists and organizers. Alex's position is to campaign on false solutions, and they thought it was quite important that we unpack that term a little bit about why we use it and what we mean. Why are these solutions false? And there are a number of different technologies which are being pursued in a Scottish context, which Hamza's book talks about in an international context. And so I'll just mention a few of those just to kind of give us a bit of a way in. Blue hydrogen is a relatively fringe technology, but there are proposals to be manufacturing a huge amount of it. Grangemouth, which is really not very far from here, it's very much on our doorstep. And this blue hydrogen, I think, is a term that we should probably be very cautious about using because it sounds lovely and friendly. And this is manufacturing the hydrogen fuel using gas. So this is just turning fossil fuel into something else. We also are dealing with proposals for carbon capture underground storage, which is an attempt to take pollution and then bury it under the sea in Scotland, and vanilla carbon capture and storage, if you like, which is trying to remove the pollution that's coming out of the emissions from power generation. And almost all of these things are both extremely dubious on their own terms. So they have proven to be unsuccessful in a number of extremely expensive, hundreds of millions of pounds experiments that have attempted to make these things work. Internationally, there have been a number of proposals to try and do these things in the UK, and they've almost always failed on their own terms. But that isn't just why they're false solutions. They're also false solutions, as Hamza said, because they maintain everything else around them in terms of the supply chain. So if we continue to be reliant on gas, then we continue to live with the emissions that come from the extraction and transportation of that gas, and also the impact on the communities that have to live with that industry. And much of this can often take on a very neo-colonial aspect. If you look at the major gas development projects in Africa, you will consistently find a link with a former European national oil company that used to be the colonial government of that country. And it's really remarkable how these relationships have managed to be maintained over 60, 70 years after these countries had independence, that we still have, for example, companies like BP and Shell are often the most active oil and gas companies in former British colonies. Shell, Dutch, British company, the most active company in South Africa, and so on, with Repsol in Spain and Eni in Italy, and so on and so on. So the extent to which this is even neo-colonial is arguable. Many of these relationships have not changed. If you were an oil exec, they were very successful in really making the impact of the independence from empire have a very limited impact on their business model. And these kinds of technologies which claim to be able to maintain oil and gas supply chains whilst reducing emissions, which they don't. But these kinds of technologies allow these systems of power hoarding to be maintained. And this is still really relevant in a Scottish context, as well as Scotland's impact, as well as Scotland's relationship with the world. Alex has written down this killer stat for me, which I've got to get right, which is that 67%, so 2/3 of the land in this country, is owned by 0.025% of the population. So 2/3 of the land owned by 0.025% of the population. So this is the tiny, not even the 1% of people in this country control the land. And so, and this is a relationship which has been maintained for hundreds of years, emerged from the feudal system as land became private. We have many of the same families that still control large portions of Scotland. Many of the families that were involved in global slave trade both took money from slave reparations to bolster their business interests in Scotland, and they used their landed wealth in Scotland to invest in that trade internationally. And we could go on about the many harms in which this system has inflicted on people in Scotland and globally. But it's really critical to understand that this is a fundamental characteristic of Scottish society, and it's one which we often take for granted, but it need not be normal. And unsurprisingly, this kind of abject inequality defines the way in which the transition is talked about. And so the biggest names that we hear who are advocating and are heard by government about how we should deal with the nature crisis, for example, are people like Andreas Paulsen, who's made his millions and millions through fast fashion, been buying up large swathes of the Scottish Highlands. It's people like Jim Ratcliffe, who owns a company called INEOS, is the majority shareholder privately, and he has just declared that the oil refinery at Grangemouth is to be shut down next year, with no meaningful plan for the workers at that plant. And it's people like Ian Wood, who's one of the foremost oil industrialists in the 20th century in Scotland, and is still the kind of premier mover and shaker in Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce. And Ian Wood's solution to the just transition is to be privatizing and concreting over a park called St. Fittick's Park in one of the poorest areas of Aberdeen. So these are the kind of feudal relationships which we're still very much living under in Scotland. And this is the 1% response to the climate crisis. This is their way, and it's largely unchallenged by. We have so far not succeeded in challenging that, which of course we must. But we can do that through some particular kind of frontline issues, which are going to be coming on for us to grapple with in the coming years. One of the things that Friends of the Earth Scotland is trying to campaign against right now is the building of a new carbon capture and storage, end quote, proposed gas power station in Peterhead in the far northeast of Scotland. We would love you all to get on board with our Peterhead campaign, which we're trying to build steam on. And the green cloak around Peterhead is that they're going to install technology which will remove the carbon emissions from the chimney stacks of the gas-fired power station. But we've just published a study where we found that there are numbers wildly out of whack. We think that probably something like 5 to 10 times more emissions are likely to come from this plant than they've claimed themselves. The thing that I find most remarkable is that the companies involved, which is the Norwegian state oil company Equinor and electricity company SSE, they have said that this is going to be a great contribution to Scotland addressing climate change. But the plant is proposed to have a lifespan that takes it up to 2054. Scotland's supposed to reach net zero by 2045. So they're proposing that this plant will be operating for 9 years in a situation where we're supposed to not be making any contribution to carbon emissions anymore. The whole thing's totally risible. It's nonsense. And this is a classic example of what happens when those who are currently in positions of power and wealth get to decide what is done in response to a problem like climate change. There are also proposals to be importing gas, which of course we're going to have to do if we want to burn more of it, because the North Sea is dwindling and Scotland's own indigenous supply of oil and gas is very much on the way out. So any future proposals to burn it are going to be relying on imports, and much of that comes from extremely dubious sources. A major source, for example, is exported from the United States, where much of that gas comes from fracking and the damage that does to communities in Appalachia in eastern United States. So this is very much a global issue, as I think Hamza has illustrated really well. But this is not something that happens elsewhere. This is something which is built on the systems of power that Scottish industrialists and landed wealth created. It is their response to the climate crisis, and we must build our response. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in the discussion, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to start with asking you a bit more about these false solutions and how, because they remind me of, they're very ideological and then they're normalized, right? And thank you for talking about the land question. Just like private property or even money, like these are false solutions that become normalized and then not critiqued. Natural gas is one example, like natural gas is anything but natural, for example. And then you're talking about net zero, carbon capture and storage. Can you tell me a bit more about your own work from COP maybe, or your research in North Africa? Who are these actors that normalize these ideological processes? How are these false solutions become normalized across many people? My students, for example, are surprised when we talk about how net zero is actually a completely false solution that is not going to help us mitigate climate change. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how these false solutions circulate, they're normalized, they're accepted, and how we can strategize against debunking these false solutions.
Very good question. I think the way I'll try to answer that question is this way. So the global capitalist classes, including the fossil fuel industry, they want to maintain the status quo. They want to continue exploring and exploiting for fossil fuels. And they want to remain relevant in the green future. So they have a few strategies. First of all, they need to appear that they are doing something for the environment. So there is a greenwashing strategy. But at the same time, as I said, they need also to place themselves in a leadership position, in a dominant position, to dictate to us what kind of technologies and what kind of solutions that we're gonna do. Like they're not asleep and just waiting. Like the tobacco industry, they spent a lot of money just denying that there is something called the climate crisis. And then when that failed, those strategies failed, because there is an overwhelming scientific evidence, report after report, showing that there is something called the climate crisis, they change their strategies to adapt to it. How do they adapt? Because they are powerful and they have the means and resources and they have access to the ruling classes and the governments, is to invade, co-opt, and hijack those spaces where those discussions are taking place. Those spaces are the COP process, the conference of the parties, the climate summits. And one way of doing it is to promote those false solutions. In fact, they're not solutions at all. At least they are not solutions to the climate crisis. They are solutions to their dilemma, to the crisis they find themselves in. There is a growing public attention to the climate crisis, pressure that we need to do something, so they need to adapt. Those false solutions, they are basically techno fixes. Like they tell you there is technology, we're gonna fix it in a technical way with technology. So we don't need to challenge the status quo. We don't need to talk about a radical social and political and economic transformation. And we don't need to talk about phasing out fossil fuels. Let's just do these things: net zero, carbon offsets, geoengineering, carbon and capture and sequestration, and everything would be beautiful. If these technologies and solutions that they were proposing were working, we may even start having a conversation. We say, okay, maybe there is something here. But they're not. Simply they're not. There are many studies, there are many journalistic investigations that looked into those carbon offsets projects, and they found them fraudulent, a scam, and they are not doing what they are promising to do. There is an Australian documentary maker who made this carbon colonialism, and he went and investigated some of those projects of carbon offsets in Southeast Asia. And he found that those forests, the trees are being cut. Because the idea of the carbon offsets is somebody continues emitting CO2 emissions, polluting, like BP and Shell, and then what they do, they pay somebody else, a company or a government, to conserve a forest, or to plant a tree, or to do kind of renewable energy, and with some kind of sophisticated equation that really does not work, they tell you, okay, I'm emitting this, the forest maybe is sucking this, so I'm gonna reach net zero in some time in the future. It's always some time in the future, it's not now. And all the scientific studies, including what the UNFCCC is saying, the UN itself, Like the mainstream scientists, all the scientists in the world, they are saying there must be no new fossil fuel projects. No new. But what the fossil fuel industry is doing, what our governments are doing, is just the contrary. Just continuing to invest more in the fossil fuels. New projects are coming online. More pipelines are being built, including in Africa. More fracking, like more extreme energy is being put there. And then they propose projects like green hydrogen. You mentioned blue hydrogen. I think maybe I'll try to explain a little bit. So hydrogen, most of the hydrogen being produced right now is produced from gas. So around 98% of the hydrogen that we have now in the world in industrial processes comes from gas, right? And it is used mainly in two industries. The fossil fuel industry to refine petroleum for refining purposes, and it is being used also by the fertilizers industry to grow food, to produce for agriculture. So what they are saying, we need to green that process, right? So we need to go into green hydrogen. Green hydrogen comes from water. They say we're not going to use gas, we're going to use water. We use a process called electrolysis, powered by green electricity that breaks the water molecule. And then you generate hydrogen. That's the cleanest form. But the fossil fuel industry says, that's in the future. For now, let's go for blue hydrogen that comes still from gas, but we're going to use carbon capture and sequestration to capture the CO2 emissions. That makes it blue hydrogen. First of all, a lot of scientific studies showed that blue hydrogen is much more polluting than gas itself. That's one. Second, the carbon and capture sequestration technology is not efficient. From what I read, like 20–30% capturing CO2. The rest goes up. And even it cannot be scaled up till now. There are, I think, 2 projects or 3 projects in the world that do this carbon capture and sequestration. So everything is done in the future and to divert the attention from the real solutions. The real solutions, keep oil in the ground, keep fossil fuels in the ground. We cannot extract more and radically transform the political and economic system. Do not sacrifice new people. And we need really to think about how do we produce and consume things. Because if every one of you here, or every household here is going to have 2 electrical cars, that would mean destruction somewhere else. That would mean more extraction somewhere else. So these are the discussions that the global ruling classes do not want us to have. We need really to challenge green capitalism, and it's eco-socialism or it's barbarism. That's how it's looking like. If we're going to leave it to the ruling classes to resolve the climate crisis, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, it's eco-fascism.
Yeah, sure. How do full solutions become normalized? I can speak a little bit about how this happens in the corridors of power. In Scotland, we did a study last year called Polluted Politics, where we reviewed the public data that's available on Scottish politicians and how they spend their time. And we uncovered and detailed 790 individual meetings between members of the Scottish Parliament and fossil fuel companies over a 5-year period, which is, I think, something like 2 a week in an average week in the Scottish Parliament. And so the short answer about how full solutions become normalized is that they're listening to these people all the time. If they're worried about the future of the energy sector, and this has been the case for successive first ministers from Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, Hamza Yousaf, and I'm sure this will be true of John Swinney. If they are worried about how they're going to keep the lights on in 5–10 years' time, it will be those fossil fuel industrialists, those big oil companies that they call, and that's partly because neoliberalism is very much etched into the kind of culture of the way in which the Scottish government operates. It is a deeply neoliberal animal. And if you listen to the kind of the speeches that First Ministers and Finance Secretaries in Scotland make, it is almost always business where they turn their attention to when they're concerned about solving long-term problems. And so this isn't just even about climate and energy, but it's about how the government wants to solve problems, which is primarily to privatise, and where we do have those public institutions as well, it's often these kind of czars who are invited from business to come in and solve problems in the public sector. Yeah, this is kind of a deeply cultural thing. And some of the examples of some of the meetings we dug up, I think are fascinating. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a few of them. I mean, probably the most egregious in my view was that Kate Forbes, who is now our Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes met oil company Equinor inside COP26 in Glasgow. And she actually had a meeting with them inside COP26. And the only other thing that I could find out she did that day was post a selfie in front of this big picture of the Earth, saying that she was having all kinds of inspiring discussions with people. She didn't mention that those people were oil companies, but anyway. Also during COP26, there was a banquet held at Edinburgh Castle. So, just up the road from here in Edinburgh Castle, the Scottish government booked it. There were oil companies attended. It was about promotion of hydrogen, and we had BP and other all sorts being wined and dined by the public purse. We had repeated incidences of party conferences being attended by oil companies. This is so normal. I mean, this happens at scale every year. SNP conference and Labour Party conference are really full of oil and gas lobbyists. Like it's so normal. I think it's been heightened in recent years because the SNP have insisted on booking what I think is probably the cheapest conference centre in Scotland, which happens to be in Aberdeen, which is very convenient for the oil companies who are based down the road. But yeah, that's extremely normal. And there are some slightly strange ones as well. We found that Paul Wheelhouse, MSP, who was Minister for Energy at the time, actually attended an American oil company conference, a company called Baker Hughes, at the Opera House in Florence. And he attended that 2 years running. And Nicola Sturgeon also went to an event with BP for a Burns supper in 2019 with the Lord Mayor, and on and on and on and on. I mean, we found hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of examples. But every time that they lend their ear to these people, to their oil and gas company execs, our decision makers are not listening to us. They're not listening to people on the front line of the climate crisis. And they're also not listening to the oil and gas workers. We published a paper a couple of years ago called Our Power, which I'd really, really encourage people to look up. Our Power, it's called. And it was based on interviews with oil and gas workers, hundreds of oil and gas workers, asking them what they want. And they want much what we want. They want a just transition. They want a brighter future. And they want a way in which they can switch. They want to be working for something that they feel is worthwhile. But the retraining is not available. The jobs are not available. And it's much too hard to turn your back on an industry which is paying a wage when the renewable industry in this country is so fragile and thin, and we have such a limited supply chain. And this is what's coming from the oil and gas workers as well. So there are so many people that our decision makers should be listening to, and we need to make sure that they do start listening to us and that they stop and we call this out.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to remember what you said about we are not going through an energy transition. We're adding, right? We're adding new energy sources to the mix. In the long run, this is not going to address climate change. And also, I think we should remember renewable energy is not really renewable when we think about the raw materials that solar panel materials come from. Again, I'm thinking about cobalt mining, for example, in Congo, right? So how one aspect I think that is important is to constantly remind ourselves and people that there are severe inequalities across the supply chain that are predicated upon existing colonial global relations. So one question is how to build global international solidarity across these places, right? Where, you know, here where people are mostly consumers versus producers. And that is also very important in the context of Palestine right now, again, to kind of build these solidarity networks that are both anti-colonial and also anti-capitalist. So this is not a question but a comment, and I invite you to reflect on that.
No, just to touch on a few points that you raised around the energy expansion or energy transition. So 2 decades ago, the corporate sector, the private sector, was saying that renewable energies are expensive. That's why we're not investing in them, right? We cannot make a lot of profits, so they need to be subsidized and so forth. So that's how they justified their continuous investment in the fossil fuel industry and mining rather than going to renewable energy. But now, renewable energy, especially solar and wind, are cheaper. They are cheap. In some contexts, they are very competitive with fossil fuels. So why isn't private sector and corporate sector not flooding and rushing to invest in renewable energy? Why is this renewable energy not displacing fossil fuels from the primary production of energy and electricity? There is an interesting book, I don't know if it is here today, it's by Brett Christophers, Why the Price is Wrong. And he goes into explaining why the private sector and corporate sector is not rushing towards renewable energy. Simply because the margins in renewable energies are smaller than the margins that they make in the fossil fuel investments. So if you leave that transition in the hands of the corporate sector, in the private sector, they are not gonna do the necessary, or they are not gonna do it fast enough in the times of crisis. So we definitely need public alternatives. As I said, energy shouldn't be seen as a commodity. It should be in the public hand, owned by the public. And there are different ownership models. That could be nationalization, the states, that could be public companies, that could be cooperatives, that could be even public-public partnerships. Just, you know, to counteract the public-private partnerships model that is being pushed all over the world, which is mainly a euphemism for the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. Basically, that's what the public-private partnership means. So we need to continue emphasizing on the argument of public alternatives. And there are many campaigns around the world, north and south, to deprivatize energy. We cannot leave, you know, that question of the transition in the hands of the corporate sector. Like they tried for 3 decades and they failed. In terms of the transnational solidarities, and I think the global climate justice movement has built and learned a lot in the last 2 decades. At some point it was very Eurocentric, very white, very middle class, but then many connections have been made with other environmental movements, organizations, indigenous communities, the trade union movement, bring in various perspectives, you know, the anti-colonial perspective, the indigenous community perspective, the environmental racism perspective, incorporated into that. And I've seen those changes myself. Of course, there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of building transnational solidarity, but also moving beyond, you know, that dichotomy, that maybe that's not the right word, the tensions that we are seeing between the environmental movement and the workers. I think that would remain. There are a lot of tensions there, but I think a convergence could happen because it happened in the past. If we think about the genealogy, where did just transition come from, that term and concept and framework, it came from the convergence of 3 movements. You know, the labor movement, the indigenous communities, and the environmental justice movement, in the 70s of the last century in the United States. So these movements came against the divide and rule strategies of the chemical industry in the United States, and they realized we are fighting one system, like that capitalist system that is exploiting the workers, that is polluting the environments, that is taking away the land from indigenous communities. So it makes sense really to come together. And of course, that just transition framework has been hijacked. Companies are using it. You know, they talk about just transition. But I think it's, for us, it needs to be like a site of struggle. We need to recapture those terms and root them, ground them in struggles, and give them a radical meaning. Because at least for us in the book, just transition is a revolutionary project. You know, it's an anti-capitalist project. It's an anti-imperialist project, and incorporates an analysis on class, race, and gender, and also democratization. What do we mean by democratization? Not just in the global south, where we tend to talk about military dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, but democratization here in the west, in the north, where workers and communities need to be at the center of any decision making when it comes to resources, when it comes to land, when it comes how we're going to use our energy and food systems. Because honestly, I don't think we live in democracies. It's just bullshit. And Palestine, you mentioned Palestine, it just shows how the facade is just crumbling of that liberal system of human rights and democracy. It's not. And Palestine can show us the way, because people continue to resist. And we need to continue to resist in the midst of the catastrophe. And we need to prepare for worse things to come. Sorry, I may be pessimistic in the short term, but that's the reality. We need to organize vigorously. We need to talk about power. It's not just about marching in the streets and calling for climate justice. That's not going to do it.
Yeah, sorry, I needed to take that in. And can I just, so the question you were asking about is renewable energy, you know, something we should be focusing on? Is that a fair reflection? Yeah. Yeah.
And global solidarity, and thinking about both an anti-capitalist stance, combining it with an anti-colonial stance.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also a little bit distracted because my feet are just completely wet through a cold.
The same. I'm struggling.
Yeah. And so that, like, about half of what I'm hearing is my feet going like that. Anyway, but we'll press on, because this is really, I mean, this is the crux of it. This is so important. And we did a study a few years ago where we looked at where Scotland gets its how a wind turbine makes it into Scottish waters or on Scottish land, and they trace the supply chain. And I do think it's really revelatory, actually, the number of different parts of the world where the transition is built in Scotland. This is just for the manufacture of wind turbines, and this was done as a snapshot of the supply chain in 2020. That we had parts of the production and materials coming from Canada, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, India, Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, Sweden, and then also a large number of countries in the European Union. So this is how wind turbines don't come from Scotland. You know, that wind turbines are a global product of the global economic system, and this represents much more of the same, as we've talked about with the perpetuation of the oil and gas industry, both in terms of the manufacturing processes and the mining processes, but also the ownership of that generation in Scotland. So a couple of years ago, we had this Scottish government organised an auction called ScotWind. I don't know why they needed to give it such a trendy title, as if, like, you know, kids were going to be like, "Hey, Mum, can I bid on ScotWind?" Like, it wasn't for us. It was for oil companies. Like, it was a large number of the bidders were oil companies, and so it's companies like BP and Equinor, who, by the way, are major suppliers of oil to the Israeli government, and we talk a little about that more later, perhaps. But it's these big international oil companies that have now bought up large sections of Scottish offshore wind generation. But I do think there is something different about renewable energy, because it is possible for a renewable energy system to be decent and to have relatively limited environmental impacts, and also provide energy for people and local communities. I think that is possible, and in many places it does happen, but it really seldom happens in Scotland. I can't remember the exact statistic, but certainly more than 95% of Scotland's renewable energy is in private hands. The vast majority of it is owned by foreign private companies. More than 50% of Scotland's offshore wind is owned by foreign state-owned companies. So national energy companies from Denmark and Norway and so on. So public ownership and community ownership is the tiniest little drop in the ocean of our renewable system in Scotland. That was not inevitable. That was planned and built in order to maintain the power of people with money in this country and globally. And we should challenge that. We really need to build up alternative solutions to bring back wealth and power into our communities. And also just remember as well that this is not how it's always been. We did have state-owned energy in this country. The post-war electricity system in the UK was built by publicly owned companies. I don't know, if you like to go hiking north of Glasgow, you will find it pretty hard to avoid a reservoir that was not built by the electricity board. Some absolutely monumental structures on the dams etched into the stone. So this was the publicly owned energy board. This was water and power for the people of Glasgow. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat what nationalisation was like in the UK. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it really wasn't that long ago that we had a publicly owned energy system in the UK. It was broken apart and privatised within my lifetime, and there is no practical reason why we couldn't have a government intervene and bring back power which generates both power for people who need it, rather than charging people exorbitant bills, but also could make a contribution globally to try and limit the damaging impact that some of these supply chains can have. So this is all very possible, and it's been done before, arguably, and we shouldn't let politicians convince us that things being 99% owned by the private sector is normal. It doesn't need to be normal.
Thank you. We had a delayed start, so I think we have about 10 more minutes, or how much? Five? Okay, so I want to collect a few questions from the audience and then ask you to give brief answers, if possible.
Hi, thank you. I will try and keep it brief, seeing as there's not a lot of time. But I just wondered, what do you think can be done to try and champion some of those voices that aren't currently being listened to in decision making, especially around like energy and the climate crisis? What do you think could be done in the meantime, just to try and get those heard, I suppose?
If there are other questions, I think we can also take them. No? Okay.
It's not really about listening to voices. It's about building power and forcing them to yield. That's how it works. I'll give you an anecdote. So I was in Baku for the COP29, and I was there specifically for the global energy embargo for Palestine. So I just went for 4 days. So the last 3 COPs, starting from Egypt, Emirates, and then Azerbaijan, are taking place in very authoritarian settings. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that just gives flavor or an indication how the COP process has become very authoritarian, does not really listen to other voices, but then at the same time gives much more power to the corporate sector and fossil fuel lobbyists. The fossil fuel lobbyists have been increasing since Glasgow, like increasingly. Glasgow, they were a lot, and then Egypt and Emirates. But the civil society, usually around those COPs, and actually that was an exceptional case for me to go inside. I don't go inside. I just organize from the outside. But the civil society, when they realize there will be no space outside, you cannot organize people's summits or counter summits, you cannot march in those countries. So they started negotiating with the secretariats of the UNFCCC, saying, okay, we need some space to protest and dissent and voice our anger and maybe do some kind of pressure. So the UN, usually in the UN spaces, you're not allowed to protest at all. So much for democracy, so you cannot protest. But given the context, they said, okay, we're gonna give you some space, you can protest, but you cannot name and shame. So you cannot name countries, you cannot name companies, you cannot name individuals. So we did a protest against the genocide. We cannot say Israel, we cannot say Palestinians, we cannot even say Azerbaijan that is sending oil to Israel. We cannot even say Turkey. We cannot even say anybody. So you end up using euphemisms, the genocidal entity, the colonial power in the Middle East. That's just a joke, you know? And this is just about Palestine. The others too, they cannot even say BP, Shell is doing this. So you say just fossil fuel industry in general. So it's not really about listening to voices. They're not. And in that space, it is an alienating space, a depressing space. Tens of thousands of people. I went to the pavilions of the countries. Those people, like I went to Saudi Arabia, there is Emirates, there is Israel, there is everybody talking how beautiful and green they are and what kind of solutions they are proposing. And I attended like an event at the Saudi pavilion. They are talking about critical raw minerals now. They want to invest in it. They are talking about blue hydrogen, circular carbon economy. People are just in cuckoo land, those global elites. They don't care. They know that there are some civil society there. They don't care about us. So I'm not saying that we need to give up entirely on the COP process because there is no alternatives in terms of a multilateral international space, because those spaces are really important for developing countries. They have a seat at the table. But I feel that we need to put much more of our energy and efforts in the outside, in building those transnational solidarities, strengthening our movements between communities, indigenous communities, trade unions, workers are really important in here, and building something stronger. Perhaps Brazil next year, because the COP30 is gonna be in Brazil, would be different. There will be a people summit outside. I don't know if it's gonna be a historically significant moment. I'm not gonna bet a lot on it, but I think the movements need to continue building and challenging the ruling classes. And I think we need to go more into direct action. Fossil fuels are not gonna yield with just people, you know, protesting, and it's not enough.
Yeah, we need a global general strike demanding an end to any fossil fuel expansion. An answer in under 1 minute, if you would like.
Thank you. I think that we need to build a really popular movement for environmental justice, and that means talking to our neighbours, organising in local communities. Friends of the Earth Scotland wants to be participating much more with supporting local community action. And I think there is so much about what we want to offer. There is so much which we can win, which is going to make people's lives better. And we need warm homes. I mean, this space is freezing. And this is what most tenements are like in this country, right? They're as cold as the Roxy, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to fix that. It's so basic. Everyone wants this. People want public transport, and people want decent work. Like these are all things which are a reasonable response to the climate crisis. But we can't just campaign in small groups and try and go straight to power anymore. We need to organize on a really large scale. We need a big popular movement. I think if we can do that in our neighborhoods, we can do that across the country, we can join that up internationally, we can win. But we do need to invest for the long term. We can't expect to just win this quickly. This is going to be a long struggle. And I think this conversation has been really enriching in helping us work through how we can meet that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick and Hamza. Before applauding them, I have two announcements. Hamza's book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, copies are available there, and Hamza is happy to sign them. The second announcement is there is a exhibition downstairs by Friends of the Earth on the popular people's resistance against coal in Scotland. So please check that out. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the last minute arrival. You were great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for
Yeah.
Can I just